Hello, so in previous videos we've discussed calculating out the length and the angles for a hip roof, but perhaps you may not be quite so good at remembering all of those formulas, so we're going to look at doing that work without any of the complicated trigonometry. So this is going to be a more practical way of pitching a simple hip end roof. So even though we don't need any trigonometry, there are a few concepts that we need to know and understand. The first one is what a run is, which is simply the horizontal distance that a rafter covers. You can see this rafter goes up the rake, but we're not worried about that distance up there. We're just worried about that horizontal distance, which is a centre line. It goes right to the centre of that ridge board, or the centre of whatever the particular rafter we're talking about butts into. And that is simply just half the span of that roof. That just means the run of two common rafters will equal the span of the roof from top plate to top plate. Notice here the overhang is a separate measurement. We always keep the overhang measurement separate from the run measurement of the rafter. The run just goes to the top plate. The other thing we need to keep in mind is what a deduction is. So our run is measured to the centre of whatever it is our rafter butts into at the top. The deduction is simply half the thickness of that item, and that gives us the spot where our power saw is actually going to run through when we cut off that rafter. So the deduction is just half the thickness of whatever the rafter butts into. The other concept we need to know is this number here, 1.414. That's the only number or calculation we really have to remember. And this is what I call our magic number for our hip ends when we're dealing with hips. I call it the 14-14 rule, but 1.414. That just means when we come to a hip end, we end up with a triangle like this, where it's 45 degrees in there and it's the same distance both ways there. And whatever this distance is here, we just times it by 1.414 to get that diagonal distance there. So if we have a situation like this where it's 2 metres that way and 2 metres that way, 2 metres times 1.414 gives us 2 metres 828 along there. And that will become very helpful, that number, when we get to our hip rafters. So let's just have a very quick look at a basic rectangular shaped building. We're going to be worried about this end down here. This is where we're going to build the hip. Let's just throw some rafters in there. So here you can see we've got a hip end this end and a gable end that end, but this hip end here is what we're going to be working on today. Now I mentioned centre lines before. Everything's measured to a centre line, so let's just throw some lines in right down the middle of all of our ridges and rafters. And in fact, those centre lines are the ones that we're going to be working to. So let's get rid of all of those timber thicknesses. So let's just quickly go over those concepts that we just mentioned. There is the span of our roof. Now, just a reminder, the span of our roof is measured across this ridge board. Okay, let's just back up to that previous drawing. Here's our ridge board in red. We just measure the span across the ridge board. If we measure from that top plate to that one, parallel to our ridge, we're actually measuring the length of our building, not the width. So let's skip back to this drawing. There is the span of our roof. We divide it in two. That gives us the run of the common rafter. And just around the corner here, it gives us the run of that rafter. Now, I know this is actually a crown end rafter, not a common, but I've just repeated run of common rafter just to reinforce the fact that this run is the same as that run. We also need to know our overhang, which is very easy. Usually it's just given to us straight off the plans. We need to know our spacing between the rafters as well, because we're going to be using that spacing in order to work out our runs of these creeper rafters, which are just in there. So that spacing, of course, it's the same spacing there as it is there. And this isn't really something we're going to have to calculate as such, but we're just going to use our common rafter here, and we're going to minus off our spacing in order to get to the top of this creeper rafter, and then minus another one to get to the top of the next creeper, but that'll be explained in a future video. The other thing we need to know is the run of our hip and the run of our hip overhang, and that's where that magic number is going to come in. We're just going to take our common rafter, times it by 1.414, and that will give us the run of the hip that sits next to it. And then of course we'll take our overhang measurement straight off our plan, times it by 1.414, and that will give us the run of our hip overhang. And that's all we need to do as far as the calculations go. So let's just quickly review what we've done so far. These are the only things we need to work out, and in fact the creeper rafter you don't really need to work out. That will be done in a more practical way when we get to marking them out. But the other ones, the common hip, the overhang and the hip overhang, they're the ones that we're going to be worried about. So in order to get the common rafter run, we're just going to take the span, divide it by 2, and that will give us the run of the common rafter. The creeper rafter, we're just going to be taking the run of our common rafter and minusing off the spacing. Hip rafter is just common rafter times 1.414. Our overhang we will just read straight off our drawings or our plans, and our hip overhang will simply be our overhang times 1.414. And that's it. That's all the calculations you need to do to start with. Just to anticipate the next video, what we're going to be doing with those numbers, I'm going to set up just some top plates in the workshop. We're going to just measure across our building, and whatever half of that measurement is, we'll mark it right in the middle of that top plate. We'll take that half span measurement or that run measurement and we'll go straight around the corner and we'll mark it down both sides as well. So that gives us the last 2 common rafters next to the hip end, and it will give us the crown end on the end of the hip. And from there we will just mark in the thickness of our timber, remembering that those run measurements we just marked are centre lines. So there's the thickness of our timber marked around those points. And now we'll just take the spacing, and from that centre line we'll just mark as many rafter spacings as will fit in from there, and from these common rafters as many rafter spacings will fit in there. Now this dimension that's left from the middle of that last rafter to the end of the top plate, that measurement there is nothing special. Alright, the important ones are from the common rafter back out here are our rafter spacings. This measurement here is just whatever is left, and it'll be something small depending on what exactly the spans and the spacings are that you're working with. Then from there we'll just mark our rafter thicknesses on them, and we won't forget to mark our hips. So this will be dealt with in the next video, where we deal with our top plates.